Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to those in a different time zone. I'm Anthony Wilson-Smith, the President and CEO of Historic Canada. You know, our memory project, which of course this is part of today, connects veterans and active serving members of the Canadian Forces with school and community groups to share stories of service. We've probably done several thousand over the years, but this is a special one for a couple of reasons today. One is that tomorrow marks the 30th year of Indigenous Veterans Day, which recognizes specifically the contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces, with a very, very impressive history behind them. And today, as a result of that, it's our pleasure to host 3 Indigenous Memory Project speakers. Before anything else, I do want to acknowledge that while this is a virtual, of course, a virtual event, our Historic Canada office, where I am, is on treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, covered by Treaty 13, and the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples. I want to now introduce our moderator for today, Shaneen Robinson-Desjarlais. Shaneen is a Cree and Gitxsan journalist and multi-award-winning broadcaster who's been on Canada's media scene for more than 2 decades. Hard to believe, Shaneen, but there we go. As a daily news reporter, first at CTV News in Winnipeg, correspondent for APTN National News, and the Indigenous Music Development Coordinator at Manitoba Music. She's now the Program Director and morning show host at CFNR in Terrace Bay, BC. And Shaneen also won our Historic Canada's Indigenous Arts and Stories writing contest in 2008. So we're delighted to have you back again. This will be the last anybody has to hear of me. Over to you, Shaneen.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That means a lot to me. Danse, Amhiluch, good morning. My name is Shaneen Robinson-Desjarlais. Simgiget, Siganamana, Gantgobowilsat, Huganiput is Negasan Mahikan Totem. Thank you so much for joining us today, to all of the elders and youth and children and everybody in between who's with us today. It's a very important recognition of some of our Indigenous veterans across this nation and beyond, across Turtle Island. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this very special day. And I would love to introduce you first to our panelists this afternoon, this morning where I am. And our first panelist today, we'd like to introduce you to all of our veterans here today are retired. Specialist 4th rank Randi Gage is the founder of one of the founders of the Indigenous Veterans Day, which of course is tomorrow. A traditional Indigenous knowledge keeper, U.S. Army Vietnam era veteran, Charter Vice President of the National Aboriginal Veterans Association, and Charter Secretary Treasurer of Manitoba Indigenous Veterans Association, among many other notable accomplishments. Randi is Anishinaabe and an outspoken advocate for veterans, especially women veterans, elders, and Indigenous peoples. Major Bob Crane is Blackfoot from Siksika First Nation and is a veteran of UN missions in Israel, Syria, and Iran, Iraq. He is a Gulf War veteran and has served in the Arctic and in the United States on exchange duty. He also served in Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Kosovo. During his time in the military, he was the senior serving Indigenous member in the Canadian Forces. Lieutenant Commander Bill Shead is a member of the Peguis First Nation. He served for 36 years in the regular and reserve force of the Royal Canadian Navy. He served as Mayor of Selkirk Manitoba, my home turf of Manitoba, Prairie Regional Director General of Veterans Affairs Canada, and CEO, Board Chair, and Vice Chair of Neeginan Centre. Bill is co-chair of the Friends of the Peguis-Selkirk Treaty, working to erect a treaty monument on the grounds of the Manitoba Legislative Building. Thank you so much for joining us today, panelists. It's an honor to be with you today. Maybe we'll begin with some of your welcoming remarks. Of course, we'd like to thank the people from all territories across this country that are joining us today. First and foremost, we're going to start this panel in a good way, the traditional way our people do begin, with an opening prayer. And we have offered tobacco to one of our veterans to open this panel today in a good way. So we'd like to ask our elder veteran now to open us up in a good way this morning.
Thank you, Shaneen. It's Bill Shead. I want to thank the Memory Project for the special efforts to organize this panel and for the very special efforts to acknowledge Indigenous veterans and our cultural traditions of offering tobacco to elders, guests, and friends. I should let you know that your tobacco did arrive by mail and it wasn't held up by any strikes or other delays that normally happen with stuff coming the great distance that this has. So thank you very much. Been quite. Veterans Week is a very busy time for Memory Project volunteer speakers, especially Indigenous Veterans Day and Remembrance Day. All of us in Canada pause to remember the fallen and to thank veterans for their service. So please assume whatever position is in accordance with your belief traditions, spiritual practices, or is comfortable, and meditate on their sacrifice and service as we pray to our Creator. Canada is inhabited by people of a wide variety or diversity of races, languages, cultures, traditions, faiths, spiritual beliefs. This morning, we've come together in our own individual fashion to pray to our Creator for our comrades in arms, shipmates, aircrew mates, our families, friends who died while serving in Canada's Navy, Army, Air Force. We give thanks to the Creator for all who served, survived, and became veterans, and for their service in uniform and in civilian life. May we always remember and honor the fallen and the sacrifices and services that they gave, and to be thankful for the veterans who continued to serve after they've left the forces. Amen. Okay.
Amen. Oh, thank you so much, kind sir. We're going to begin our questions this morning. I'll begin. I can't see all of the young folks that are tuned into this, but I just want to say that I know there's several folks joined in from all across the nation. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time. I think this is so important for our young folks to learn the history of our veterans and the wars of days gone by, as well as especially the Indigenous folks. We have a very unique story, our Indigenous veterans, so I'd like to begin. I'll begin with Randi. There were some questions that were sent in prior to this from young folks around Canada as well. There was a question sent in for you, Randi. Was there a particular experience or event that inspired you to found Indigenous Veterans Day?
Bonjour, Megasikoy Indigenous, Hagichitakoy Mongdodum. Oh, yes, there was a particular experience. It actually happened in 1991 when a group of Indigenous veterans were refused to be able to lay a wreath during the National Day of Remembrance on November 11th. That upset a lot of people, and so the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples got some funding to try to get us together to where we could actually have a national organization. And they pulled us all in. They during 92, they went across the country. They had a gentleman going across, getting us all incorporated into groups. And then we had a national meeting where the Indian Brotherhood was changed from the Indian Brotherhood, which was strictly First Nation, to the National Aboriginal Veterans Association, which was an all-inclusive for First Nation, Métis, Inuit, Rangers, and RCMP. And so it went forward from there. I was given the mandate as the new vice president of the National Aboriginal Veterans Association. My mandate was to go get the day. That's about all that they gave me, just go do it. So I did, and I was at that time working for a gentleman you might know. His name is Bill Shead. So he was down the hallway and kept me from jumping off of the top of 181 Higgins many times. And we just pushed it through until we had a day. That's how it all started. That was what happened.
Thank you so much for that, Randi. I'll move along to Bob. One of the questions from the young folks. What does it mean to serve as a civilian like you did in Bosnia?
It's a good question. The military back then, this is back in 2000, felt that they could free up some bayonets and I hope you can hear me, free up some bayonets or soldiers by having civilians fill roles that were done previously by the military in the areas such as information technology or logistics. And I was honored to be part of that effort. I was working at the time for a company that won a contract to provide these services to the military overseas. At the time, they thought this contract was a very first, but that was not the case because in our history, there's examples of civilians being contracted to provide services to the military all the way back to the Red River Rebellion. But it was great being back overseas. I had gotten out of the military because I thought that's enough travel. But when the company won the contract, I went back overseas. And I started working with some of the same people I had worked with while I was in uniform. A very interesting job. I actually ended up spending close to 3 years in Bosnia from 2000 to about 2003. And then went on to other countries of the world to do the same thing. But Bosnia was the first experience. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And Bill, what are some of the main differences between being in regular forces and reserve forces? One of the questions from our young folks out there.
Very little, particularly in the Navy. The big thing is if you are in the regular force, you're in it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year long, even when you're on leave. In the case of being in the reserves, your commitment is to serve on a part-time basis. Generally, you will be committed to doing perhaps 1 night, 2 nights a week with your unit, where you would go through your general basic training and other duties as the unit itself needed to train others and to advance your own trade. You would also be available to do some longer term training, perhaps 2 weeks, maybe even longer, full time, and usually with the armed forces. But your primary role is, if you're in the reserves of the militia, is to be ready to go in and fill the ranks of the regular force as needed. In cases like that, when there is a need, it's still a voluntary duty to be able to go and serve for that period of time. And it's quite surprising that there are a number of people who have civilian jobs that allow them to do that. And basically, you have to have an agreement with your employer, if you're serving with the reserves, that you would be able to take time off to go and serve, and then come back to your job. Your job would be protected. So that's the Coles Note version. I hope that answers the question for the individual who asked it. But if you are looking for more information, I would simply go down to your reserve unit, any reserve unit of the Army, Navy, or the Air Force in your community, and they would be able to be happy to answer your questions more fully.
Thank you so much. There's a few other questions here, and I'm going to ask the panelists the same question for some of these and just hear what your answers are for the young folks that are tuned in today. So there are a lot of really great questions here, but I would love for our young people that are listening, especially the young folks that don't come from countries where there have been war, to understand, I guess, the role that the Canadian military plays in different war-torn countries. So if you could talk a little bit about that and just kind of letting our young people know what it's like to be in that situation, in that moment. You know, I think that, you know, we see things on TV, we hear things on the radio, we're told stories, but to have been veterans in these situations, if you could paint a picture for our young folks listening today. I'll begin with Bob, please.
Okay, so the question you've asked is, you know, what's it like to be an Indigenous veteran in these situations, or what kind of roles has Canada played in these theaters?
I guess the role, not just as a veteran, you know, just as a soldier in these war-torn countries, both as a Canadian soldier and Indigenous, but what maybe just from your perspective, the things that you saw and the things that, you know, the reality, I guess, of being in those situations for our young people that may not understand exactly what wartime is.
Good question. I've been to a lot of places overseas, and I think what struck me most strongly, more forcefully, was the culture of those nations, how they live. Having any preconceived ideas of how they should live, it's not worth your time or effort. When people are raised to have certain beliefs, certain values, certain behaviors, it's not your place to change that. You're there to correct a situation, like, for instance, in Israel and Syria, UN mission, you're there to observe the peace. Not really peace, they're technically still at war, but you're there to observe the ceasefire between Israel and Syria. So the force is actually in between the two belligerents. In Iran and Iraq, it was to observe the ceasefire because there was a ceasefire between Iran and Iraq. They had been at war for 11 years. Totally different culture, different regard for how even the military are supposed to behave on their land. So, for instance, the Canadians that were on the Iranian side were basically under house arrest for the entire tour, whereas we in Iraq, it wasn't that onerous. In the Gulf War, we had to observe the country's traditions and culture. For instance, we couldn't roll up our sleeves, but yet we were there to protect their freedom from Saddam Hussein. So you kind of have questions in your mind about, well, really, if I'm here to save your country, what difference does it make if I roll up my sleeves? Because it is very hot there. But again, you're there to do a job, and in the Gulf War, it was part of a coalition to force Saddam Hussein out of the country and to give Kuwait back to its people. In other places I've been, I think that's the greatest thing that I've noticed is the difference in how we look at things. So what you've got to do is elevate yourself above that and concentrate on the mission at hand, get the job done, regardless of the circumstances or how difficult it is. Enjoy it because you're probably not going to see it again. Take those memories home with you and share them with others. Canada has a absolutely fantastic reputation of being United Nations peacekeepers, even though it's a role that we haven't fulfilled lately. And our reputation in areas like coalition or even in Europe right now, where the Ukraine is fighting Russia, you know, the reputation of the Canadian soldiers there is second to none. I guess what I really want to wrap it up by saying is that these are different areas that you go to, different expectations of you. So being a Canadian, you sort of have to put yourself at their level and then do your job.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'll move along to Randi, if you could please answer that question.
For me, it's the people, the children. You don't realize how strong and resilient the children are. But as Bob said, you know, the culture, not being able to do a lot of things that you normally would do, wearing a skirt that's too short, just having to be very comfortable in a very uncomfortable situation and not knowing exactly where your safety zones are at times. But for me, it's always been the people and the ability to communicate, even though you're two different languages, being able to get that communication going. I don't know how it happens, but it happens. And it's a very unnerving situation, but also seeing how lucky we are to live in North America compared to what's outside of these shores. We're very fortunate, and every child listening should realize how fortunate they are and learn not to throw a tantrum if they don't get the latest toy, because there's children out there that they would just like a pair of shoes or a pair of panties or a shirt that doesn't have holes in it. So yeah, it's the people for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Bill, I'll move that along to you, sir.
War is a pretty foreign object for those of us who live in North America. However, there was a time when it was right to the shores of Canada, where we had submarines sinking ships in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and just off the shores of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, where in fact, the closest one was just in front of the Halifax approaches, where a couple of ships were sunk there. It's hard to imagine what the situation was like in an all-out world war. I was born 3 weeks after the Second World War was declared. I was 6 years old when the war ended. So I grew up in an era when the population of Canada was about 12 million. Of the 12 million, 1.2 million men, women enlisted and served in uniform during the Second World War. That's a good portion of the population. Today, Canada has a population of 42 million, and we have, I believe, less than 100,000 people serving in uniform, regular and reserve forces. We have not had to participate in a major conflict to the degree that we did in the Second World War since the end of the Second World War, and has not had the impact on us. Certainly after the Second World War, we had a period called the Cold War, where we lived with the threat of an all-out atomic war between the East and the West. As kids, we were required to learn how to protect ourselves in case of an atomic bomb being dropped on our community, to duck under the table, your desk, etc. Those were pretty frightening periods. And even during the Second World War, I can remember as a child looking at my relatives coming home in uniform on leave in the house. I could hear the airplanes flying all around southern Manitoba that were here training to go overseas and take part in the Second World War with the Air Force. Those sorts of memories are still with me, and the impact that war left on people of my age probably motivated us to continue to serve in the forces and transfer that to others. So serving in the Canadian forces today is slightly different than serving in wartime. So it's difficult to transmit what some people in Canada have experienced. The people who have been coming here from war-torn eras. There are people from Vietnam that came here when they abandoned their country after the Vietnam War. There are people who are here from other war-torn areas that are still fresh in their memories. So for those of us who have lived in Canada for a long time, and we've been sheltered from that experience, it's very difficult to gain an understanding and to get people to be motivated to join the Canadian forces. And we're really having a difficult time keeping our military fully manned. And that's a challenge. And it's not a challenge because there's a war imminent. It's a challenge because you need a force in being to be able to train others when there is a need for more men and women to go and serve in a fighting situation. And it's going to be a very complex job if we don't have the people serving today in either the regular force and the reserve force.
I think getting back to Randy's point, excuse me, Shannon, is that, and Bill alluded to it as well, is that when we realize what we have here at home, and you realize what people don't have overseas, I mean, that's the reason why you're going there in the first place. When you realize what you have at home, it's worth protecting. It's worth putting yourself in harm's way and protecting our way of life. It's worth it. Protecting our land, protecting our people.
Thank you so much. And, it's just, especially as Indigenous veterans and elders, it's those teachings along with, the next generation that, whether it's our people as Indigenous people, but young folks understanding the role that veterans have played for so many generations. And I feel, having had grandparents on both sides that served, it's natural in our blood almost as Indigenous folks to want to be warriors and to be protecting, our territories and our people. And so I guess with that, I had another question in mind after this, but with that, what is the importance of, not only our Indigenous kids, but all of our Canadian young folks to, like you said, protecting our way of life and that knowledge, protecting that knowledge. And I thank you again to Historic Canada for creating, spaces like this so that our elders, our veterans can share their stories. What would you want young folks out there to say that we're considering, going into the Canadian forces in the future? What would you like to tell them? I'll start with Randi for this one.
I just answered that question a few minutes ago because I was on a Zoom prior to this one with 900 students in Toronto. And they basically asked, why should we go? What should we do? What's important about it? And it's just the fact that, as Bob was saying, our land, our home, our resources, our everything, we're so fortunate here. And going into the military, you have the world is in front of you. You can get trained to do whatever job you really would like to do and not have to pay the huge prices that the people out here, the civilians, do. They will train you in marvelous jobs. IT, my goodness, anybody in IT, jump in there because the world is opening there for you. So to any young person out there that's even slightly considering going, absolutely, you should look into it. Talk to an elder, talk to the veterans, talk to the recruiters, but make sure that if you do that you've got a good grounding in your education. It's very important to have your math and your sciences and your ability to read and write. And by writing, I don't mean sitting at a computer and typing it out. I mean having a pen in your hand and writing to where somebody can legibly read what you scribbled on there. It's tomorrow. We need you. We need people to go there and keep it going. Bill and I won't be around much longer, so we need replacements, please. Off to you, Bob.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I didn't realize I was muted. I was talking, but thank you so much. I do appreciate that. Yes, we'll move along to Bob for that.
What would I advise younger people that are looking at a career in the military? Well, first of all, the military career is not for everybody. There's no way. But it is one that I highly recommend that youth look at today. I mean, I left home right when I turned 17. I joined when I was 16, but I left when I was 17. And I learned how to take care of myself at a very early age. I learned I learned skills that I continue to use today, like Randi said, learning how to write, how to speak in front of people. They taught me how to speak Russian. I worked in the intelligence field in signals intelligence and electronic intelligence. I went to university to study electronic warfare and radar for that purpose. I learned how to lead. I learned how to manage. I understand what different cultures are all about, having traveled all over the world. And I know about my freedom and where it came from. And from those veterans who came before me that answered the call and they sacrificed. As the saying goes, all gave some and some gave all. Well, this is my family. This is a legacy that I assume as a veteran. And I expect all veterans have that same legacy. Pass it on, pass it on. Talk to a veteran, get to know where he served, get to know where he's from. Even though we may be out of uniform, it never leaves you. Having been in the military, it never leaves you. They say you could take the person out of they can take the uniform off the person, but they can't take the person out of the uniform, I think is the way it goes. There are all kinds of opportunities to look at. Not too long ago, I was the resident counselor and advisor to the military at Saint Jean, Quebec, which is Canada's basic training facility. And they offer a course that basically is just go in and kick the tires for 5 weeks to figure out if you got what it takes to join the military. They do all the same stuff that you would do on the normal military course, like physical fitness, weapons training, field craft. It's designed to climatize you to the more rigorous training that you would undergo later on. For instance, I found that our youth are not as physically fit as perhaps the youth of previous years. They're more quieter, they tend to keep to themselves, but if they understand the legacy that warriors like Joseph Brand, Tecumseh, Pontiac, John Sokoe, Louis Riel, Crowfoot, Poundmaker. I'm missing so many outstanding, veterans who, really earned their spurs, got medals that are absolutely unbelievable for feats that are hard to imagine. Tommy Prince is another example. Unless you understand what you are taking on, I think you're missing an opportunity to do so by joining the military.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'll move it along to Bill for that.
Well, quite rightly, the two former colleagues spoke about the extraordinary opportunities that there are for anybody who joins the Canadian Forces or any military force. When it comes down to it, though, when you're making your decision is not going to be motivated by a sales pitch from the recruiter, nor is it going to be motivated by your love of country or whatever the case may be. It'll be something within you that will get you to move, and you're going to have to discover that yourself. In some cases, it might be by pure accident. For example, when I went to military college, I had two friends who were extraordinary cadets, and they later in life told the story of how they joined up. They were both classmates in high school, and they were looking for something to do, their next step, and they saw this opportunity to go to military college. And one guy said, well, I'll go. And he says, well, okay, I'll come with you. And that was as simple as that. It was a friendship that motivated them to do that. And in many cases, individuals will make up their mind because they have a family member who has served that they know, or they have somebody who had a bad experience in a particular country, and they want to go over there and help them out. For example, I'm sure that there's an awful lot of Ukrainians in in countries other than Ukraine who would be motivated to go and serve their country or their former country. So there's an awful lot of things that are you just can't define. For all of the opportunities that we have to serve in the Canadian peacetime forces, it's just incredible. And you can have a long career, a very long career, 30, 40 years in some cases. If you look back when people were mobilized to fight, particularly in the Second World War, their time of service was at the maximum 6 years, the period of hostilities. And they did, very few of them hung on to serve after their time in wartime. So there's all sorts of things that go on in terms of how you are going to make your decision. Your decision in peacetime is going to be completely different than your decision in wartime. But at some point, you're going to have to make a decision as to how you are going to live your life. And in my estimation, your life is not complete unless you are of service to mankind in some form or another. One option is the Canadian Forces. Other options are out there in terms of serving the police force, firemen. You can serve in politics, government. There's all sorts where you have a broad opportunity, and that's the key, is service. You have to be motivated to serve, not yourself, to serve others. And that's the key to being a successful and worthwhile member of the Canadian Forces or any force.
Can I add to that, Shaneen?
Yes, absolutely.
Throughout our history, Indigenous veterans have punched way above their weight class. Indigenous veterans continue to serve, as Bill's talking about, serving their country and their home community. Bill was the mayor of Selkirk. I know personally of two Indigenous colleagues, Indigenous veterans of colleagues of mine that went on to be chiefs of their respective nations, many more that became counselors. So it really, really puts you in good standing for when you go back to your community, because you have the skills to serve your community. And I agree with Bill that it's all about service.
Thank you so much, Bob. With that, as Indigenous peoples, we are unique, our veterans. And if you could tell some of our young folks, maybe either whoever can answer this question best, to tell or to explain to young folks what happened to many of our late veterans when they chose to serve this country when they were status Indians. If one of you can talk to the loss of many of our veterans, how they had to give up their status when they decided to serve this country. If one of you could please speak to that.
Can I give the example of my uncle Tom? Tom and my mother and my aunt, three of them were at Indian Residential School in Elkhorn, Manitoba. Two of them contracted TB and were isolated on the veranda of the school. And the Indian agent at the time had visited there and saw that these children had TB. And when he got back to the reserve, he urged their parents to get them out of the school and into some sort of health facility. This they did. Tom had TB that affected his back, and the doctor who saw him put him into a metal cast. It apparently cured him and didn't leave him with any defect. My aunt had one leg shorter than the other as a result of her TB. My mother didn't have TB and lived to be a great age of 97. But Tom, when he went to enlist in the Army in 1939, the doctor who examined him was the same doctor who had treated him for tuberculosis, and he ended up marking him fit for duty. He served with the Fort Garry Horse, took part in the D-Day landings, and he went through Europe, came back safely, and unfortunately was killed in a mining accident in 1952 in northern Manitoba. Now, here is an individual from a band that had their original reserve surrendered illegally in 1907, and the people were displaced to what is now the Peguis First Nation, some 200 kilometers from where I live now, and in the town of Selkirk, because the original reserve was called the St. Peter's Band of Indians, and it was located just on the northern boundaries of the city of Selkirk. Now, despite the fact that these individuals, the Peguis First Nations, the people, despite the fact that they had their land surrendered, and it was excellent land, they had it well established, they'd lived there for 100 years, they had it well developed, there were roads, churches, schools, grist mills, etc. The land was surrendered. They ended up fighting that for 104 years before they were able to get a settlement just on the surrender claim. But yet this individual, my uncle, willingly enfranchised so that he could serve. You know, it's hard to fathom that. I can't, despite all of the things that have happened to him, going to the residential school, coming from a community that they went through all of that trauma of moving and surrender, et cetera, et cetera. It's just hard to imagine how you would make that decision to join. I can't answer the question. And I don't think anybody can answer the question, because every decision that is going to be taken by an individual to serve is going to be completely different from another individual. What do they use? What criteria do they use? I don't know. There's any number of criteria that you could use. One, they want the opportunity to participate in the general economy of Canada, perhaps. But to give up their language, to give up their family connections, because when you enfranchise, you're no longer a member of the band. You can't go and live back on the reserve. There's all sorts of things that are behind this enfranchisement. Now, thankfully, today you do not have to enfranchise to join the forces. And in fact, it was changed sometime around the Second World War, particularly in the latter stages when country was running into problems recruiting people to come into the forces. They waived the requirement for status Indians to enfranchise before serving. But that's done now.
Yeah, thankfully. And yes, of course, I encourage you young folks that are tuned in to, search out stories like this and learn about what, residential schools are, and learn about the reality of being a First Nations veteran in the past, with people like Sergeant Tommy Prince, one of the most decorated veterans in our country, who was, once he came home and served this country, was not able to go to his community, and was neglected by Canada after serving. And that happened to many of our Indigenous veterans that were just cast aside once they served this country. Okay, I'm going to move it along. I'd like to chat.
Can I Can I add to that? Because this was part of the legacy that obviously, Randi and Bill and I have assumed. This is a story of our veterans and what they went through in the First World War and Second World War and the Korean War. I mean, Indigenous veterans weren't conscripts. They were all volunteers. And back in the day, this was, very difficult. Some Indigenous veterans changed their name. They didn't say where they were from. They didn't say that they were Indigenous. The women weren't even regarded as Indigenous because they just didn't say so. Education called for by the Air Force at the time, we're talking the Second World War, was too high for our people. The Navy wanted you to be a British subject. And as Bill has said, due to diseases like tuberculosis and poverty and stuff like that, there may have been hundreds, perhaps thousands of Indigenous people who wanted to sign up, but they just couldn't pass the medical examinations. But the overwhelming support for Canada's war effort, shown through our enlistment, their contributions to charities and labor and wartime industries, that was a measure of our people's willingness to assume our responsibility in the crisis that was facing Canada. Now, they say there is probably in order of 12,000 Aboriginal or Indigenous, and I use the terms interchangeably, that have served in both world wars and Korea. But, we must remember that records of status or registered Indians, they were kept, but there were no records kept of non-status Inuit or Métis veterans. So statistics can never be quite accurate. And Bill already talked to enfranchisement, where they go over and fight for their country and come back and find out they have no home to. Poof, you're no longer an Indian. That's basically what enfranchise consisted of. For crying out loud, until 1951, veterans weren't even allowed in the Legion. It's not the Legion's fault. That was because of the Indian Act at the time that forbade, put restrictions on Indian people to, go to where alcohol was served, including Legion halls. So here are these veterans, they served with non-Indigenous veterans, they sacrificed, they died equally, but they came home and they couldn't even have a beer with their former comrades. The first Indigenous woman to lay a wreath on behalf of all Canadian mothers who lost children to wars, that didn't occur until 1972.
Yeah.
And 1995, we were now allowed to lay wreaths at the National War Memorial in Ottawa. And we have veterans who are serving today or recently served in places like Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Haiti that performed tremendous feats and have been decorated for such. This is our legacy. This is what they went through. And did they complain? No. Somebody already mentioned the fact that I think it was a National Brotherhood, the forerunner of the AFN, that consisted of veterans. They came home and saw how unfair things were, and they lobbied on everybody's behalf. They got onto the government and said, hey, this is not right. And a lot of the rights that we enjoy today as Indigenous people, Indigenous veterans, are from those veterans that have come before me, certainly, and us. So that's our legacy. This is what I mean, is that when you join the military and you stay in the military, you all of a sudden understand that, and you are proud. You are proud to serve. You are proud to carry on with that legacy.
Thank you so much.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yep, of course.
Very short and quick. I've been told many times by individuals, veterans that were in the residential schools, male and female, that they chose to go into the Canadian Forces or whatever it was called at that time, because they would rather die for the land that is our Mother Earth than to die for something that they didn't understand or be beaten to death for spilling their porridge. And that came right from some of the veterans that had been in the residential schools.
In fact, Randy, our treaties, our people hold their treaties in a sacred way. This is our promise. It's a contract. And simply because we have treaties, a lot of veterans volunteered because they felt it was an obligation because of the treaty. They didn't think
Yes.
selfishly. They said, no, this is required by our treaty. We don't really have to fight for Canada, but we're in treaty with them. So if they have a problem with somebody, we have a problem with somebody.
True.
We don't have a lot of time left. Quickly before we wrap up, I just wanted to direct a question to Randi as far as being, a woman in the military, an Indigenous woman. Can you tell us a little bit about your unique experience as a woman who served, an Indigenous woman who served?
As a Indigenous woman, as an Indigenous female, we're raised to be nurturers, protectors. We're raised to bring forth life like Mother Earth and to make sure that we raise that and it moves on and does our generations. And when you go into the military, when I went into the military, I'm not going to generalize, I'm going to tell you exactly for me. I walked in the door as an Anishinaabe who was a gentle soul. Bill won't believe that, but I was a gentle soul when I went in. And I went through my training. I became a armor supply specialist. And one day when I was issuing something, I can't even remember what it was, it struck me that I had gone from being an Anishinaabe nurturing my job as the creator had placed me here to handing guns and bullets and missiles to people to go out and kill another woman's child. And that was a very, very awakening moment for me, a very hard moment for me to realize that everything that I had been stripped from me, and I had been changed from a protector, a nurturer, a human bearer, to being a killing machine. Even though I wasn't personally going to pull that trigger, I was handing that to somebody to go and do it. So that part of it was hard for me. Being a soldier, being in the Army, I mean, come on, I was in a company of 650 men and I was the only woman in it. Of course, I'm going to enjoy that, but it wasn't much fun because I ended up having 650 brothers instead of anybody to date. So, it's a roller coaster of life, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. It was marvelous. There's a lot of things that I can't tell you that are impacting even today on female soldiers. We're working very hard to get those things to stop, but it was a roller coaster of emotions, but it was good. So that's all I got to say on that.
Okay.
Thanks for giggling, Bill.
Thank you so much. We do have to wrap up here, but I would love for all three of you to leave the young folks that are tuned in with some words of encouragement. Of course, tomorrow is Indigenous Veterans Day. It's something that I've respected and been a part of and celebrated since I was just in junior high school. And I was raised in a home to know that the stories of our veterans and the legacy of our Indigenous veterans in this country and in the United States as well. And as a mother, I have three sons. I have a 10-year-old, an almost 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And my oldest son, knows about his Musham's history, it being in residential school, and he's learning about what residential schools are and did, and he respects that. And now his dad and I are teaching him about the important role our veterans played in history and just how lucky our children are. And like you alluded to earlier, I believe it was Bob or Randi, that our young folks are different nowadays. They don't understand that history of why they're so lucky and life is so easy for them. And not easy, but a lot of our young folks have challenges. But what I'm saying is that there is a lot going on around the world that they are, and they're lucky to be in this country, and they're lucky to have had people serve to protect this territory for them to enjoy the life that they do have. And I really think that a lot of our young folks that have come from war-torn countries appreciate the territory that they're in now. And it's thanks to many people like you as Indigenous veterans. And I just thank you all so much for sharing a bit of your story today. I would like to ask you all to leave the young folks with your final words. And as of course tomorrow is Indigenous Veterans Day, how do you hope that all Canadians and these young folks, I guess, pay homage to that day tomorrow? I'll let Bob start us off.
Don't be afraid of veterans. We don't bite. And we certainly like to tell our story. Go up to a veteran, talk to them, thank them for their service, find out where they've been, find out how they feel about where they've been. And that'll help you understand what other people have done for all of us. That's about it.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'll pass it along to Bill.
Well, the young people have an advantage to all of us who are certainly my age. I hope that you will remain curious, that you will always keep one thing in mind, that you're not alone, that you have a responsibility as an individual to define your future yourself. Don't be forced into something that you don't want to do. But remember one thing, that because you are an individual, you are a member of the human race, you're a human being. Your responsibility doesn't end with self. Your responsibility starts with yourself. And your role in life will include looking after others. You're going to be a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, a grandparent. At some point in time, you're going to have responsibilities and love for other individuals. In some cases, you're going to be required to make some very, very difficult decisions that affects them and you. And the only way you can prepare yourself for that is by not thinking of yourself in isolation. You have to think of yourself with a view to your responsibilities to serve others. And if you keep that in mind, I think that you will be able to make any very difficult decision that you will face in your life.
So much.
Well
We'll
said.
move. Yes, thank you so much. We'll pass it along to Randi.
I think what I would, like Bill or Bob said, don't be afraid of us. Don't be afraid to go to a powwow. Don't be afraid to go to whatever is happening tomorrow. The doors are open. It's full of love. It's full of all kinds of great things happening. But the thing that I would like to leave with you, students and adults, and if there's any media out there, you look at these things that we're wearing on our chest. They're pretty ribbons and they've got little dingle dangly things that shine. We're not adverse to talking about them because they mean all kinds of things. But please don't just run up to a veteran and say, tell me about that. Please walk up to a veteran and say, could you tell me about that? Because each one of these represents something that might be painful. You know, I usually use the top row and say this first one here, that was my loss of innocence, because that's what happens when you join. The next one was my signing of that check. That there's my life. If you need to take it to protect you, okay, fine, I'll step in front of the bullet for you so that you're protected. And this commemorative over here on the side was, for me, commemorates my first adult love, who stepped into Vietnam and was there 6 months and was killed. So these medals are things that we wear because the government hands it to us, because somebody gave it to us and said, good job. But each one of them is also a painful memory for a lot of people. So approach it carefully, please. And enjoy. Just get out there and enjoy. We do like to laugh. We used to drink beer and laugh, but now we just get to laugh. So come and join us.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists for your knowledge and your stories today, and for making time for this. Thank you to Historica Canada, of course, for always sharing the stories of people across this country and making sure that our young folks know exactly, you know, the true history of this country. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Bob and Bill and Randy, so much. And all of you young folks out there, I hope that you took some really great knowledge with you today. Egosane, kinanasko metnan. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.